Political reform may not seem like the most interesting topic in the study of history, but as we'll see, the life of Cleisthenes is anything but boring. Despite enduring multiple exiles, he was able to overthrow the last major tyrant of archaic Athens, Hippias, and after a struggle for power with the aristocrat Isagoras, he would lead Athens during a time of contention between not just Athens and Sparta, but also with the growing power of the Persian Empire. Most importantly, however, he would restructure the political organization of Athens, and thanks to his reforms, he has been called the father of democracy. Hey, I'm Matt, you're watching Nothing New, and today we're covering another famous ancient lawgiver, Cleisthenes. Together with Solon, he was one of the chief architects of Athenian democracy, and his life would see Athens transform from political instability and tyranny into one of the leading powers of the Greek world. But before we get into it, want more videos on ancient history and culture? Make sure to subscribe and hit the bell. Anyways, let's get into it. We covered the tyranny of the Pisistratids in full depth in our previous video in this series, but in case you didn't see that video, here's a quick recap. After the reforms of Solon, political factions still vied for control over the city. Through a series of tricks, Pisistratus seized power over the city and established himself as Tyrant. And after his death, his sons Hippias and Hipparchus assumed power. But like their father, who Aristotle called a mild and good ruler, they had a somewhat good reputation, and they were known for patronizing poetry and culture. But as we discussed in that video, this was probably done to distract the population. So it's debatable whether they were really good rulers or just had good PR. What isn't debatable is the reputation for political violence, which they were also becoming known for. Cimon, son of Isagoras, was killed simply because a series of Olympic victories increased his popularity to the point that he was seen as a threat. Opponents began plotting ways to get rid of the tyrants, and one plot even managed to assassinate one of them, Hipparchus. But Athens would need the help of Sparta to finally free itself from the increasingly harsh rule of Hippias. This is where Cleisthenes comes in. Leading up to this point were a lot of bumps in the road for Cleisthenes. He was first exiled by Pisistratus along with his whole family, who were often exiled when drama flared in the city, since they were considered to be cursed ever since the days of Cleisthenes' great-great-grandfather, Megacles. After the death of Pisistratus, Cleisthenes was able to return and even became the eponymous archon for the year 525, but within a few years he was once again exiled. Thankfully, his family was owed a favor by the Oracle of Delphi, since they had previously paid to have the temple rebuilt. So Cleisthenes asked the oracle to persuade the Spartans to lend a hand and help free Athens from tyranny. Though the first attempt by the Spartans, led by their king Cleisthenes I, failed to remove Hippias, a second expedition in the year 510 succeeded, and he was forced to flee. Hippias would spend the rest of his life looking for an opportunity to return home and take back power, conspiring first with the Spartans and then with the Persians. He even accompanied the Persian fleet during the first invasion under Darius, and suggested they invade at Marathon. But the threat of the Persians reinstalling him as tyrant inspired many Athenians to fight, and Hippias would die on the return journey after they were defeated in that famous battle. With the tyrant Hippias finally removed from power, Athenian politics once again became a battle between factions. Cleisthenes found himself facing yet another rival, Isagoras, who succeeded in being elected archon in the year 508. Essentially, Isagoras was a reactionary, and his political platform of revoking the citizenship of those whose ancestors had received it under Solon and Pisistratus made him popular with the aristocratic faction. This plan was rightfully opposed by Cleisthenes, which earned him broad support from the people. Isagoras, realizing the threat of Cleisthenes' popularity, dredged up the old superstitions about his cursed family and had him exiled with the support of Sparta. And unfortunately, this would not be the last time that Athenian oligarchs allied themselves with Sparta. But this time, Cleisthenes went too far, and when he returned to Attica, he expelled 700 families at the request of Isagoras and tried to establish an oligarchy. This didn't go well, and after being blockaded in the Acropolis for 2 days, they capitulated to the people and fled the city. Cleisthenes and his supporters were welcomed back to Athens, and he quickly got to work to resolve the competing factions of the city. The two major issues which Cleisthenes would have to solve in order to secure the democracy which Athens would become famous for were that he needed to break up the traditional tribes and strong influence of the old noble families, and he needed to find a way to stop particular politicians from gaining too much power through popularity. In order to break up the power of rich families, he practically abolished the 4 traditional tribes. which from that point on only existed for ceremonial purposes, and in its place established a new system of 10 tribes. First, he divided the city into 3 geographical areas: the city, the shore, and the inland, which partially overlapped the old divisions of the hill, the coast, and the plain that competed for power during the time of Pisistratids. After that, he then subdivided each area into 10 trides, or thirds, which were made up of existing villages, known as demes. Therefore, there were 30 trides, despite the name. We'll see why they were called thirds in just a second. The demes numbered at over 100, and the amount of demes in a tridus varied since they were not equal in size. He then took 1 tridus from each geographical area and combined them to make a tribe. This is probably why they're called thirds, since each tribe was made up of 3 trides, 1 from each area. This new base of 10 tribes also led to the reorganization of the Council of 400, known as the Boule. Now it was the Council of 500, made up of 50 members chosen annually by lot from each of the 10 tribes. However, 500 people is a lot for a council, so instead each tribe would be in charge for a tenth of the year. These 50 presiding members were called the Prytaneus, and the Prytany came to be used as a measure of time, roughly equal to a month. The Boule was responsible for preparing the agenda, which would be discussed in the assembly, along with managing financial and foreign affairs. This was one of the first political systems that we know of to follow the principle of proportional representation, since the 50 members from each tribe were distributed among the demes in accordance with the population of each. One of the key features of Cleisthenes' system was the use of selection by lot, known as sortition, and by the middle of the 5th century, almost all positions were filled with this method. While these reforms are rightfully remembered as one of the most important steps Athens took towards democracy, Cleisthenes may not have been acting out of some purely philanthropic spirit, and we should consider the political motivations and results which may have benefited him. One motivation for reorganizing the tribal structure of Athens may have been that Cleisthenes wanted to conceal the non-Athenian origins of some of his supporters, since he expanded citizenship to include the free inhabitants of Attica. And while old family loyalties were disrupted by this new system, it didn't seem to have affected the power of his own family, which remained influential as seen in the later figures of Pericles and Alcibiades. But at the same time, Cleisthenes was not granted the same tyrannical powers that were given to Solon to reform the constitution, so his measures had to be passed by the assembly and were therefore the product of democratic action. The most vivid example of how these reforms affected not just political life, but also social life, is how patronymics were abolished in favor of demonymics. That is, instead of calling yourself by your father's name, people now identified themselves by what deme they came from. The result of these reforms was that the most significant political distinction no longer corresponded to social differences, like the divide between nobles and commoners, but instead the purely political distinction between citizens and non-citizens. As the political historian Cynthia Ferrer puts it, political status was firmly distinguished from personal, social, or economic attributes, and freedom and order were construed politically as the product of the interaction of political equals. Cleisthenes' reforms affected not just the social, political, and religious parts of life, but also the military. The army was reorganized on the basis of the 10 tribes, and each tribe elected an infantry commander, cavalry commander, and most importantly, a strategos, or chief general. The archons still kept their administrative roles, but their importance was soon surpassed by the board of the 10 strategoi, which would go on to become the most prestigious executive body in Athens. Unlike the archons, which were chosen by lot after the year 487, the commanders of the army were elected and could serve as many consecutive terms as they wished. And as a result, later generals like Themistocles, Cimon, and Pericles would exercise great influence over not just the military, but also politics. Since the Council of Elders, known as the Areopagus, was composed of former archons, the loss of prestige of the archons affected the power of the Areopagus, which was previously one of the most powerful institutions in Athens. While their powers seem to have never been clearly defined, they may have begun as counselors to the king, and in Solon's time it was the central governing body of Athens. But by the time of the reforms of Ephialtes around 462, its main function, other than scrutinizing elected officials, was as a court which presided over serious crimes such as murder. Cleisthenes is also credited with introducing the practice of ostracism, which was used to exile politicians who gained too much popularity. If you think about it, exile was seemingly a regular occurrence already, so it makes sense that Cleisthenes would have wanted to establish a legal process for it. If you want to learn more about ostracism, make sure to check out my video all about it. Links down below. One thing we should keep in mind is that, while writers like Herodotus called the constitution of Cleisthenes a democracy, it was not how the people of Athens or Cleisthenes himself would have described it at that time. The Greek word for democracy seems not to have been invented until more than a generation after these reforms. Instead, Cleisthenes described his reforms as isonomia, equality before the law, similar to the term Isagoria, which meant equal rights to speak. Its emphasis is on establishing equality of opportunity, rather than just popular power. As we saw earlier, Athens was not safe from the interference of Sparta, and the Athenians had to have been suspicious of them after the episode with Isagoras. So in the year 507, during the time Cleisthenes was leading Athens, they sent out an embassy to Artaphernes, the brother of the Persian emperor Darius. The Athenians wanted an ally, but this was the king of kings they were dealing with. He wanted tribute, not allies. And so if they wanted an alliance, they would have to give King Darius earth and water, a seemingly innocent request. The envoys agreed, probably unaware of the significance of making such a deal, since to give earth and water meant surrendering all their rights to their own land and recognizing the Persian authority over everything, including their lives. As Herodotus tells us, the envoys consulted together, and in their desire to make the alliance, they consented to give what was asked. They then returned to their own country, and were there greatly blamed for what they had done. The Athenians would later support the Ionian revolt against Persia, which was seen as a great betrayal to the King of Kings. He was so angry that he had a servant remind him every night before dinner to remember the Athenians. Unfortunately for us, at this point the historical record falls silent, and we just don't know what Cleisthenes was up to after his reforms or much in general about what happened in the years between these events and the eventual invasion of Greece by the Persians in the year 492. But what we can say for certain is that Cleisthenes is one of the most important reformers in the history of Athens. It may not have been as dramatic as ending debt slavery, like Solon accomplished, but Solon's reforms also weren't enough to stop the tyranny of the Pisistratids. While all this stuff about demes and trities and councils can seem boring, this reorganization of the political structure was incredibly important for the fact that it laid a much more stable foundation for Athenian democracy to stand on. As Athens became more and more democratic, later reformers like Ephialtes would begin to challenge the power of the most conservative and long-standing institution of Athens, the Areopagus. And while there were attempts to re-establish an oligarchy, both during and after the Peloponnesian War, democracy would persist in one form or another until the rise of Macedon under Philip II, father of Alexander the Great. But those stories will have to wait for their own videos. Anyways, don't forget to like and subscribe if you learned something new. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.